Today on the Hobby Bench, I'll be painting up the Hulk for Marvel Crisis Protocol. So initially starting out, I gave Hulk a coat of Troll Green contrast paint. And then working on his pants, I wanted to use Twilight Rose as a contrast paint. And like a lot of these contrast paints I have, it basically is gray primer, dry brush it white. Working on this is laying a foundation for these contrast paints. And so you just want to give a nice even coat. Just try to go as much as you can, as carefully as possible. There's quite a bit on this model to cover through, and I thought like contrast paints initially would be like a great way to go. And I gotta say, at least it's a nice purple for these really purple pants that he usually has. So I was pretty happy with that coat at least. And just carefully going through it, one section at a time, and just try not to get over too much in other areas. But of course, working with contrast paints, you can get a little bit of wiggle room there and working with that. So I had that laid down with the Troll Green. I mixed that up with medium olive. And this is an intermediate tone. And so what I'm going to try doing there is really, in the deeper recesses, just leave it that original Troll Green. And then for these other sections there, that's a little bit closer to where his muscle gets defined, that's where I'm going to want to try to work on sort of blending that color in just a little bit. So as you're moving up towards the highlighted parts of the muscle, that's sort of like more of the foundation I'm having for those colors there. That's the idea, is just to sort of give a subtle transition between the two, slowly work through the areas there. And you can sort of see again on these raised muscles, maybe just a different angle on that. I'm just trying to get in there and go through those areas that have a little bit more of the upper definition of the muscle. And the idea there is just sort of have that transition between that Troll Green that would be in those recesses, moving up towards that. And so I keep blending up there now, and now I'm adding lime green again with this mix. It's about a 50-50. And the idea is, you're just trying to work towards the highlights of the muscles, the upper parts that would give some definition. So you can look there on the back of his hands, like maybe where the bones is sort of sticking through the raised part of his hand, and just slowly sort of blending that in quite a bit. And then working on his thumbs and picking that out. And so I've got that laid down. I went back and gave a final highlight of lime green and just really sort of pick out those upper levels of his muscle there. And so you can see it a little, almost like too much contrast. And so the work around that, what I'm going to be using is green ink with a lot of medium mixed in. And the idea there is just to sort of give it this nice uniform shade. And it's thin enough with the medium that it'll be somewhat transparent. So it should allow the lime green from the upper section to sort of bleed through and really give a nice, deep, dark color in the base of the contrast. And that's what I had. It looked okay. It's looking all right. And I want to say, well, I'm just trying to soften those transitions just a little bit more. And so I decided to go back and use lime green mixed up with green ink. And the idea there is just to get those deeper recessions, just try to blend that in just a little more. And so I had, this mix through. And the idea there is that transition of those muscles there from those upper levels to those lower levels, just slowly work around, the edges of that and just try to soften that transition a little bit between those. And that's what I sort of was working through. And this, carefully going along. And like, as I mentioned, that this is almost like an exercise in futility, because at the end of it, I hated the look. It was just too much contrast. I just didn't like it at all. So I really wanted to soften that up a bit more. And so, I just went back and basically in the lower section of that, where his muscles were defined up there, I went back with medium olive and just covered it all up. And from there, I'm thinking that was getting back the base that I wanted. That transition there with the contrast, with the green ink, it was just too much. It was just too much. I just didn't like it. I just didn't care for the look. So sometimes, I want to say, you're doing a model, and if it's going away, you don't like it, just stop, and just try to go back in a different direction. And so now I sort of want to go back and repeat what I did. But here I'm just using, again, medium olive and lime green, just using those acrylic paints and just sort of just doing that process again. And the idea there is just to soften that transition between those muscle areas and the darker recesses there. And that's what I sort of worked through and worked on. And the idea here is to sort of pick out those areas between the upper levels of muscle and like down in the cracks and crevices, and just have that subtle transition, just using a mix of those two colors there to sort of even that out. And frankly, I think that this left a more of a base color that I sort of liked. And so the idea here is just to go through and leave that foundation and then go back again with another wash to sort of tidy it up a little bit. But I think that having that medium olive just for me laid a better foundation of the skin color that I wanted compared to maybe using that contrast and then definitely using that green ink. And before it looked okay, but it was just, it's almost like a cell shading look that I just didn't care for. I just didn't want to go that direction with the Hulk. So it's crazy, but sometimes, you just have to do those sort of things and just try some different stuff. And of course, working through here, trying to do as much as I can. And so just working my way along the muscles and just trying to blend that in a little bit more, just add more of a subtle transition between those two and just try to make it a little bit less jarring. And it's giving a better angle here, a little bit more of a highlight. You can just see those dark areas there. That's what I'm sort of really working on. It's just around the edges of those and just try to get that subtle transition. And of course, I get a little visitor now, so it looks like I have to take a little bit of a paint break. He wants some attention. Yep, I'm not getting any painting done. Okay, cap break is over. So now I've got that transition in. I think that works out pretty well. So I'm going to work on his hair. On this one, I'm going to be using Hospitallier Black and Lizard Green just as the contrast paints. And I did this before with She-Hulk, and I think it looked pretty cool. So that's what I'm just going to be working with those two. And I ended up giving it 2 coats just to really make it stand out a little bit darker than I wanted. But I think overall, this looks really great. Obviously it's black, but it's got that tinge of green in there, which I think works perfect for the Hulk. And just going through this, I ended up giving 2 coats because you can see it's just thinned out a little bit too much at the top there. But at the end, really liked it. So now I want to be picking out his teeth. And for that, I was using pale sand and white mixed together just to soften out that white somewhat. And here, I'm using more of a fine brush and just want to be very careful and just try to carefully pick out his teeth and not really go too much into there. And it's just not incredibly difficult to do, but you just want to try to be careful and not slather and slop it everywhere. So I just want to carefully pick out his teeth just to give that to stand out because, he's just given that big grimace there as a snarling face. And so, obviously he's showing his teeth. So I just want to pick those out a little bit more and highlight that small detail of the model. So I've got that done. It's looking good. Now I'm going to go back to the pants a little bit more. And I want to give a transition a bit more of the upper levels of the folds of his pants and stuff like that using purple. And so the areas, again, I think they're going to catch some light. I'm just going to go ahead and just give that some purple. It's thinned down a little bit. And the idea is just to sort of work along here. And actually, sometimes you can just use like bright light and just sort of see, I'm looking at some areas that have that slight reflection that you might get sometimes with the contrast paint there. I'm figuring, okay, those are the things I want to work at. That's what I want to work on the highlight, especially, the jagged edges of his pants. And I want to just bring it out a little bit with the purple. And so just trying the idea of leaving on the seams and the lower folds of his pants, I have that purple in there. That would be from the Twilight Rose. And then sort of the upper levels there, just, bring it out as regular purple and sort of highlight that a bit. Of course, you're working on the edges there, definitely on the side of his belt for his shorts. And looking all right, looking pretty good. I'm going to transition it out just a little bit more using blue violet. And this is just like a lighter shade of purple. And the idea is to sort of mix those two a little bit 50-50. And so I'm just going to give it a more of a subtle transition of those two and just sort of highlight. Again, this is where I'm sort of focusing on areas I think that are really going to catch the light and sort of be these upper folds of his shorts and sort of bring out those details more. That's what I'm going to really sort of focus on. So obviously working on a little bit on his button of his jeans there and, on the edges and stuff like that. And I'm trying not to get too much on there because you've already got that purple foundation that looks pretty good. So I'm just trying to pick out a couple more places I think that would catch a little bit more light. And so that's what I sort of want to use this mix on for those. Just sort of working through here. The idea is just to get the, upper parts of his shorts. And sometimes you can use a little bit of some brush strokes in there to sort of add that look of like some cloth and sort of roughen up that and give it a little bit of a texture. Now, so for the manhole cover, I just used Camouflage Green contrast paint, worked out pretty well. And for a lot of the cracks and stuff like that, I ended up using black Lotus, which is sort of nice because it's almost like a tinge of blue with that. I thought that looked pretty good. And so for a lot of the gravel and stuff like that I work on, I added this a little bit more of some talus and stuff to the base originally. Put that in there too, just to sort of get those cracks and add a darker shade to that. And then I'm just going to use a regular craft paint and just give a real rough texture over most of the model here at the base of that, and sort of break up that concrete color a bit. Just trying to be very careful on the edges here, like around the manhole and stuff like that. And the idea there is just sort of add some, this textured look, a little bit, an uneven look on this concrete, and just sort of break that up a little bit from your typical gray primer look that I had there. And nothing fancy. And I personally, as I said before, you want to use good paints for your miniature, but for like bases and stuff like that, I think using craft paints are just perfect for that. And it's not a big deal. And here I'm going to just use just a different shade. It's a little bit lighter gray. And that I'm just going to sort of go back to some of the debris that's piled up, those piles of rubbles and rocks. I'm just going to give that a nice dry brush of this gray, this lighter shade of gray, just to sort of make that stand out a little bit more. And that's the idea there, is just sort of go through and give this debris just a dry brush. And end up going back again and just using a mix of some white with a lighter gray, just to add a final highlight to a lot of these rubble piles, just to add just a bit more of some shades of color in there, just to really sort of pick out the upper levels of that. So I can just make that stand out a little bit more from just the regular base. And nothing fancy, just sort of give a quick coat. And here, of course, you want to be careful. You just don't want to be getting over in other sections of the model. That's why I'm sort of brushing towards me and brushing away from the model. So if there's anything that flecks off, it's going to flick off on my hand and not there. And there you go. That's the Hulk. And, I got to say, I'm happy with the way it looked. I think before it was going in a direction I sort of liked, it was sort of cool, but it just ended up almost like a cell shade look. I just didn't like the recesses of the muscles being that much of a dark green. That the transition was too much. And I sort of went back again and just used that medium olive, and I think I was just happier with it. It's a little bit more of a subtle shade of those two. And I think that's the look I sort of really wanted to go for. And it's stressful sometimes, when you're doing this thing, you got something in your head and you put it down on the model and it just looks horrible. Like I said, if you're not happy with it, then just, stop and just go back and repaint and get something that you want to look at. So I think I said he looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with him. Can't wait to get him on the tabletop.